Hi, I'm Jim Lindsay, the director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law here at the University of Texas at Austin. I want to welcome you to today's talk, which is part of the Strauss Center's Bridging the Gap series. Our Bridging the Gap initiative seeks to explore how universities can better contribute to policy making on global affairs. It is very generously underwritten by the Ford Foundation of New York. We are honored, even more than usual, to have our guest speaker today. He is someone who in his career has bridged the gap repeatedly, distinguishing himself both as a scholar and as a policymaker, Dr. Stephen Krasner. Now, I was going to read all of the things that Steve has done in his career, but that would poach too much in his time, so I'll just try to give you some of the many highlights. Let's just say it's fitting that he is giving a talk in a place called the Legends Room here at the University of Texas. Steve is one of the foremost scholars in the world on international relations. He is currently the Graham H. Stewart Professor of International Relations at Stanford University. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and he is a senior fellow by courtesy at the Hoover Institution. During the course of his career, Steve's work has dealt primarily with trends in state sovereignty, American foreign policy, and the political determinants of international economic relations. He is the author of several books, my favorite being Defending the National Interest, which I can recall reading in my first course in graduate school. He has also written numerous articles and book chapters on various topics. He was chair for 7 years of the political science department at Stanford, so I think people still owe him a lot. I'm sure that wasn't the easiest of tasks to have. He's also served as director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford. As I mentioned, Steve has distinguished himself in government as well. In 2001, he served as a member of the staff of the Policy Planning Office at the U.S. State Department. Policy planning was created in 1947 by the legendary George Kennan at the request of Secretary of State George C. Marshall, and it serves as an independent source of policy analysis for the Secretary of State. Policy planning staff is to take a long-term strategic view of American policy. I think Steve's going to talk a bit about that today. In 2002, Steve moved over to the White House, where he served on the staff of the National Security Council as the Director for Governance and Development, and he worked on the pioneering Millennium Challenge account. And from 2005 to 2007, Steve was the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, where he worked very closely with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And by tradition, the Director of Policy Planning has been regarded as sort of one of the most intellectual members of the foreign policy operations in the United States and the U.S. government at the State Department. And we're blessed because actually we have not one but two former directors of policy planning at the State Department. Dean Jim Steinberg of the LBJ School has joined us as well, which we appreciate. Join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Krasner.
Thanks. That was a very nice and generous introduction. One thing I've noticed about the length of introductions or the kind of biographies that people get in conference programs and such is the longer you live, the longer they get. You just keep doing stuff, you know. It's not that it's better or worse, it's just more of it as time goes on. Okay, so the title of this talk was Four Policy Planning Stories in Search of a Theory. Since I actually offered the title, I think I found a theory. So this is something I've been thinking about for a year since I left government, and I'm going to start with the theory and then tell the stories and see if I can integrate the stories into the theory. So a real challenge is, if you're an academic working in government, is to try and think about, what's the relationship between these two worlds? It's obvious that these worlds are very different, and that they connect with each other, but far from perfectly. And the issue is, how do you think about, what this world, how these two worlds actually join together? This closing the gap idea, which is a term that I think actually originally came from my colleague Alexander George, is one way of thinking about these issues. I'm going to actually argue here that I think it's a wrong way of thinking about the issues. So let me begin. The question for me was, could I find a theoretical framework which somehow captured what went on in government in a way that would allow me to write about it in a way that was academically interesting. And when I was in Washington for the first time in 2001 and 2002, I did kind of, out of the miasma of stuff that I'd read when I was doing organizational theory, think that what you really, the most appropriate kind of policy-making model that I thought was out there was a garbage can model, which was a model that was developed in the 1970s, primarily by Jim March, who was an organizational theorist, is an organizational theorist at Stanford, and a couple of his colleagues, one Cohen at Michigan, and Johan Olsen, who teaches in Norway. And the basic idea of the garbage can model was this, and they start off the 1972 article by saying that they're writing about what they call organized anarchies, and in fact, their example is universities. And that organized anarchies are characterized by the following three things. One is, actors within these environments, these organizational environments, have unclear preference orderings. Secondly, the participants in any particular decision-making process change over time, or sometimes change very rapidly. I know when people have asked me about, how do I put together the best, I want to get into graduates, a PhD program. How do I put together the best record? What I always say is, these are not committees like undergraduate admission where they kind of routinized. You have faculty members on these committees, they change every year. Different faculty members have different views about what's useful. So there is no way of sort of thinking about what your ideal CV would look like. And finally, so you have changing participants, unclear preference orderings, and things operate by trial and error. And I want to read a couple of quotes from actually the second page of their article. Okay, this is from the March Cohen and Olsen article in 1972. From this point of view, an organization is a collection of choices looking for problems, issues and feelings looking for decision situations in which they might be aired, solutions looking for issues to which they might be an answer, and decision makers looking for work. And they go on to say, to understand the process within organizations, one can view a choice opportunity as a garbage can, into which various problems and solutions are dumped by participants as they are generated. The mix of garbage in a single can depends on the mix of cans available, on the labels attached to the alternative cans, on what garbage is currently being produced, and on the speed with which garbage is collected and removed from the scene. All right, the basic argument here is that policy processes in any kind of complex organization don't follow the rational actor model, something we've critiqued for a long time. They don't follow either Lindblom's kind of incremental model because you can have some dramatic changes. But they're a lot the result of random processes when a problem, a solution, and a person happen to come together. John Kingdon, who actually also originally writing in the 1970s, wrote a book about the policy-making process. The book was mainly based on empirical work that he had done about transportation and health. We'd spent a lot of time interviewing people in Washington on these two issue areas. And Kingdon reframed this March, Cohen and Olsen framework in a way that I actually found more helpful, and that I have to say rang true to me in terms of my observations about Washington. So what Kingdon says is, if you want to understand the policy process, what you have to understand is that there are three streams involved in the policy-making process. These streams are more or less independent. They kind of flow at their own rate. And policy outcomes are the result of a haphazard convergence when these streams happen to come together for reasons that are more a result of, they're not quite random, but they're not the result of any kind of logical policy-making process. The first stream is what Kingdon calls policy generation. Problem generation. That is, why do people come to recognize some things as problems and other things as not? And he points to crises as one reason. And in looking at transportation, the potential the bankruptcy of Penn Central, which could have crippled the Northeast Corridor, is an example of this. Budget demands, legislative renewals, feedback, information on how something is working can all be mechanisms that can generate problems. In foreign policy, I do think that most of the problems are actually generated by external crises or demands, although some of them are certainly generated internally as well. So problem generation is the first stream that's flowing. The second is what Kingdon calls generation of policy alternatives. What kind of solutions are available out there? And this policy alternative stream is made up of bureaucrats, think tanks, and academics. And something that I did find extremely useful in this framework is to recognize that academics, are only one part, especially in the United States, of a really big and actually quite robust process that involves people from inside the government and outside the government. And this policy alternative stream develops policy proposals. If these proposals are going to survive, they have to be technically feasible. They have to in some way fit with policymakers' ideology. So someone working in a bureaucracy may have a set of ideas which are completely inconsistent with the people that are actually running the country at a particular time. They have to be able to survive budget constraints, and you basically have to have these things. You have to cook these policy alternatives in what Kingdon, I think, appropriately calls the policy soup. And they have to be cooked for a long time, and by the time they're ready, they really have to be good. Just in talking with Jim and Jim before I came in here, one thing that's striking when you're on the outside and you look at policies that come out of Washington, in some ways they look straightforward, and you never see this incredible architecture beneath them, in which basically for any policy that you're seeing publicly, policymakers have looked at all the possible alternatives. They've looked at things they think might go wrong. They've examined these things very closely. So if you want to have a policy alternative which is going to have some kind of traction for policymakers, it's got to at least be the best thing that's out there. And the soup might not be fully cooked, but it's got to look more persuasive than something else. And within this world of the policy soup, what really matters is persuasion. You've got to be able to persuade other people that what you're doing is a good idea. You don't have other kinds of leverage. You can't just tell them to shut up. You've got to be able to persuade them that it works. So this policy alternative is the second stream. And the third stream is politics. Politics involves lots of stuff. What's a national mood? Do key players change as a result of elections, or because cabinet officials change? Something you've obviously seen, in the last year and a half in Washington now, even without a new administration. Do chairs of committees change? So you have someone who has a particular idea at a particular time. The political stream operates essentially through bargaining. It can operate through persuasion too, but basically, people that are making political decisions, if they want to get someone else to go along with them, they're going to try to cut a bargain with them. That's the way politics works. Now, they may try to persuade them as well, but basically, they're going to try to cut some kind of bargain with them. These streams, that is the problem generation stream, the policy alternative stream, the politics stream, come together in what Kingdon calls a policy window. These windows do not necessarily stay open for very long. They may stay open because you have an election. They may stay open because the national mood is in exactly the right place. And when they do open, you want to be able to get your stuff through right away. So it has to be ready to go. And the fact that it's ready to go, even if it's cooked for a long time in the policy soup, it doesn't mean that you're going to get some kind of nice program coming out the other end. And policy entrepreneurs then play a kind of role in bringing the stream together, in wedding the problems, the possible policy alternatives, and the politics. This way of looking at the problem, I think, is very different than the closing the gap way. So I'm going to caricature the closing the gap framework a little bit. But I think if you look at Alexander George's work, or Lepko Ninchik, or Bruce Gentleson, or Steve Walt, or even Joe Nye, all of whom have written about this, their complaints basically take the following form. They say if you look at academia, the problem with academia, or especially, let's say, academic international relations, is that scholars don't put enough weight on policy-oriented work. And the discipline doesn't reward people for doing policy-oriented work. And this is absolutely true. There's no incentive in IR, international relations, to try and focus your attention on variables that are manipulable by policymakers. And in fact, I would say usually just the opposite. So we try and write theories about structural conditions that policymakers can't possibly change. So you can make an argument that the United States is a hegemon, and therefore we're going to have certain dynamics in the international system. Well, there's nothing that any policymaker can do about the fact that the United States is a hegemon or not. And there's not much incentive to kind of write about things which policymakers may change, although it's not that you're discouraged from doing that. So I think a lot of the literature on liberal institutionalism, which is about institutional design, is actually something which policymakers can manipulate. So it's not that you're discouraged, but you're certainly not encouraged to do this. But the basic, kind of complaint of the closing the gap, school or model of decision making is, if you could get academics to do more work on policy-oriented research, their research would be better. If their research would be better, policymakers would use it more often. And if policymakers used it more often, we'd have better policy. I find this totally unpersuasive, I have to say. I think the policy, it's so much a kind of rational actor model of how decision-making works. My view is the process is much more complicated than that. It's much more garbage can or this idea of alternative streams. What comes out is much more haphazard, and that it's much more useful, I think, to think about academic international relations research as something that can go into the policy alternative soup, where a lot of other people, bureaucrats, think tank people, are also working. And it may or may not make a real contribution to policy. And whether a really good idea does make a good contribution to policy, it depends on whether a policy window opens at a particular moment when there's someone who has that idea and is prepared to run with it, and when there are political decision makers who think those ideas are persuasive. So that's my kind of framework for thinking about these issues. Right now I'm going to tell you, a few stories about, stories that I was involved with in policy planning, things where I was more or less, well, not more or less, where I was in the room, and try to say something about how this works. These are none of these are headline issues, I have to say. So they're all much more specific. I'm going to start with the notion and concept of transformational diplomacy. When I arrived as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department in February of 2005, Secretary Rice had already begun speaking about transformational diplomacy. And she sort of turned to me at some small meeting, and she said something like, and we've been friends for a long time, and we came to Stanford about the same year. She said something like, we're talking about this, but I don't think we know exactly what we mean. And the basic notion was this. You're in this environment in which the domestic authority structures of other states look to be much more important for American interests, including national security interests, than the international distribution of power. The State Department is organized basically to do state-to-state relations. That's what people are trained to do. You go and talk to other foreign ministries. That's sort of its core mission. It's not that State Department officials, Foreign Service officers haven't been doing lots of other things. They have. But basically, the State Department, and frankly the rest of the U.S. government that deals with international affairs, is basically organized to do state-to-state relations. The State Department deals with other foreign ministries. The Defense Department fights wars against other states. Now, it does a lot of other things too. But it's basically organized to fight wars against other states. Rice gave a speech, actually, about a year later at Georgetown University about transformational diplomacy, which, got some resonance in Washington, but which a lot of her colleagues around the world actually took note of in my conversations with other policy planning directors. A number of them referred to the speech. My British counterpart referred to this transformational diplomacy speech as a piping good speech, something which Americans doesn't really trip off in Americans' tongue. All right, so what was the basic idea about transformational diplomacy? Great power conflict is unlikely. You can have big threats from relatively small states. Conventional notions of sovereign states as being able to control their own territory are often irrelevant in the international environment. Rice said in her speech, the fundamental character of regimes now matters more than the international distribution of power. And she then said, so I would define the objective of transformational diplomacy this way: to work with our many partners around the world to build and sustain democratic, well-governed states that respond to the needs of their people and conduct themselves responsibly in the international system. All right, when she asked me to sort of think about this problem, it just came right out of all the stuff I'd written on sovereignty in the previous decade. So mostly what I've been thinking about was the fact that we had this notion, I mean, a basic argument about sovereignty was, we have these notions of sovereignty with very clear rules, but in fact, the rules have been frequently violated, especially this idea of non-intervention. And that if you're dealing with an international anarchy, you're dealing in an environment where policymakers obviously have a choice of trying to influence the behavior of other countries in a number of different ways. Some of those ways are conventional. I mean, you could try to bribe them, you can offer them trade agreements, you can fight wars with them, you can threaten them, but you can also obviously try to change the nature of their domestic authority structure in one way or another. And in fact, a lot of the Cold War, I mean, was not just a bipolar conflict between the Soviet Union in this bipolar and the United States in this bipolar world, but a lot of it was about, were states going to be communist or capitalist? You know, we fought wars in Korea and in Vietnam on an issue that had to do with the nature of domestic authority structures in these states. Not because in some way we thought they would alter the international distribution of power. I mean, Korea, I mean, mattered some. Vietnam mattered hardly at all. But what was at stake in the Cold War was this notion of what was the domestic authority of other states supposed to look like. So I'd seen from my academic work that it gave me a way of thinking about this issue of transformational diplomacy and made it very easy for me to write a memo that could get translated into at least pieces of this speech. So it was an example of, here was an academic idea in a book that was, you know, a completely academic piece of work, which did get translated into the way in which a policy initiative was framed. And what is striking in this is the randomness of it. I mean, that wasn't that, the problem was there. And the term transformational diplomacy was there. I didn't make that up. And someone would have thought about it, but they might have thought about it in a somewhat different way, and maybe, you know, if you're being generous, in a somewhat less refined way. But the fact that it was there and available was the result of the fact that, you know, Rice and I played tennis together. I mean, it wasn't the result of the fact that I had like some brilliant idea, which someone who was asked to write the memo on transformational diplomacy would have ran to my books and said, oh, Krasner has this idea, I see how we can write this up. I mean, it never works that way. So it's very much the result of this convergence of a problem, a solution, and a person. It has actually meant something in practical terms for the State Department. So State Department's moving Foreign Service officers from Europe to Latin America, Asia, and Africa. It's meant some changes in the way in which the Foreign Service Institute out in Virginia is running courses. It's meant some changes in the requirements for entering into the senior foreign service, including a requirement that you serve in more challenging positions. It's meant a little bit about, in terms of people talking about greater interagency coordination, which, as I'll say later, is an extremely difficult problem and one which I think is going to be very, very hard to solve. All right, so that's my first story, transformational diplomacy. And there's a very direct kind of academic link, but you can see the randomness in how this happened. Second story is a story about responsible stakeholders. In the summer of 2005, Robert Zellick, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, gave a speech about basically China's engagement with the world. And in that speech, he challenged China to be a responsible stakeholder. And this was not so different than this idea of positive engagement with China, which the Clinton administration was used. But it kind of reflected the fact that China was now a much bigger player in the international environment than it had been before. And the idea was that you wanted to persuade China that if it didn't follow the rules of the international system, it wouldn't just be bad for the international system, but it was going to be bad for China too. China was a big enough player in the international environment to actually be able to undermine the rules, and China itself depended on the rules. So he wanted to argue to the Chinese that they needed to think about themselves, okay, the sort of parenthetical thing, which was never said, was they couldn't be a free rider anymore. They had to think about themselves as a stakeholder in the system because they were such a big player. All right, so where did this idea come from? There was someone on the policy planning staff, a guy whose name is Evan Feigenbaum, who's still working at the State Department, now in the South and Central Asia Bureau. Evan was actually the best person on the policy planning staff that I'd ever seen. He was great at framing ideas, which is a real challenge and very different than what you would do in academia. And he knew everything about East Asia, which was his portfolio. And if he didn't know it right away, he could find out in about 5 minutes. All right, Feigenbaum had written a memo in 2002 to the secretary. This meeting, memos always go to the secretary. It floated around in which he'd said something like, China should act responsibly as a stakeholder in the international system. So responsible stakeholder would not act. The words weren't right next to each other, but they were there. This memo, it just sunk into no place, which is what happens with most policy planning memos, which is sort of a kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall character to this. And some of them stick, often in ways, that are surprising to you, and a lot of them don't stick. This was one that didn't stick. So this just went no place. All right, Zellick comes to the State Department, and a couple of things were critical. One is that Zellick was very interested in China, and it was something that he wanted to concentrate on. So here you had a major figure, the Deputy Secretary of State, very interested in this issue of China. Zellick then met with the policy planning staff. This took, weeks to arrange this meeting. Probably, maybe even a couple of months, because the schedule of someone at a deputy secretary level is so congested that taking out 45 minutes to kind of chat with people is extremely costly. But Zellick, we finally arranged this meeting, and staff members in policy planning basically have different assignments for different bureaus, either regional or functional in the State Department, went around the room. And even in this kind of setting, Evan, you could see that this was a really smart guy. Plus he was doing China. And what happened was Zellick immediately kind of asked Evan to work with him on this China initiative. Evan opened the drawer and pulled out this memo that was still there from 3 years ago, because unlike some of us that can't find the stuff that we've written, even, you have to use Google search now, because who knows what name did you actually give that document, and you hope that it comes up. Evan opens the drawer, pulls out the memo, gives it to Zellick, and actually one of Zellick's, so he's working directly with Zellick, put responsible and stakeholder together. All right, this really worked. It was really a good idea. It's actually, at a larger level, very consistent with kind of liberal institutionalism. You're really not going to the Chinese and doing what we sometimes do, which is telling them what their own interest is. We're going to the Chinese and saying, you're not acting. We agree with your conception of your self-interest in this case, but you're not acting in your own self-interest by not being a responsible stakeholder. The reaction of the Chinese, I have to say, was, it was interesting. It's a bureaucracy where someone said to me, if you put something in one end of the Chinese bureaucracy, something definitely comes out the other end. It might not be what you want, but something definitely comes out, which is not true for all countries. Sometimes you put something in one end and nothing ever comes out the other end, even though you beg and cry for something to come out. But it was interesting, we had lunch with the Chinese ambassador. The Chinese ambassador asked Evan and I to have lunch with him. And they were clearly, this was a bit after Zellick had given his speech, and they were clearly trying to figure out what responsible stakeholder meant. So someone told me there was no term, there were no characters in Chinese that could actually capture this right away. So they went through their kind of list. Is this balancing? Is this hedging? So they went through their list of possibilities. We talked about it for a long time, and you can see that it generated a lot of interest in China. And they finally kind of noodled it around and figured out what it meant and came to a conclusion about it. But it was it's an example, I think, of a conceptualization where, again, Zellick was clearly going to do something with China. And you can sort of see what's in the cards for what he wanted to do. But would he have done exactly the same thing if Evan Feigenbaum hadn't been working in policy planning at that time? Well, you wouldn't have had responsible stakeholder. And here was an idea. The quality of the idea had not changed from 2002 or 2003 to 2005. What had changed were the people that were making the decision and what their interests were. So again, you have something that's a very kind of haphazard and random process in how this works. And I do think, in talking with the Chinese, about what they're doing in Africa, for instance, or encouraging them to join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is something to try and get better governance in oil and hard minerals exporting states, having this kind of conceptual framework was useful in terms of making a case to the Chinese. All right, so that's my second story. Third story, which is more a story about politics than it is about conceptualization, foreign assistance reform. I spent a lot of time in my first year as Director of Policy Planning thinking about, how you might reform the way in which the U.S. government administered foreign assistance. Now, I have to say here too, there was a random element to this. Rice asked me to do this because I'd done a lot of work on the Millennium Challenge account early on, so I knew something about foreign assistance. So it's not something where I had real academic expertise. And I knew something about the way the U.S. government had worked, but certainly a lot less than a lot of other people that might have been around. But I did have the advantage of, in something like this, of being a neutral actor, since I had no bureaucratic axe to grind. So here was a problem, and it reflects this kind of general challenge that the administration saw in terms of what you should be doing with your foreign policy. If you really think your foreign policy and your national interests are entwined with what happens in relatively weak actors in the international system, how do you think about how you can most effectively interact with them, and how especially do you think about how you can use foreign assistance more effectively, if that's one of the tools which you have available? If you look at the administration of foreign assistance, we did a little something, which is, of course, has now been quite controversial. But if you look at foreign assistance in 2005, there were 19 separate accounts for foreign assistance in the State Department and USAID. If you want to move money from one account to the other, you have to notify Congress. Some of these accounts give you some general flexibility. Some of them are very specific, like child health. The amount of de facto control which the Secretary of State had over these accounts were pretty small. So AID, the administrator of AID, does report to the Secretary of State. But the reporting relationship has been pretty attenuated. And the ability of the Secretary of State in 2005 to reach into, especially into AID, which is in a separate building 10 blocks away from the State Department, was pretty weak. At one point, part of what prompted this was Steve Weissman, who was the New York Times reporter covering the State Department at that time, asked Rice how much the U.S. government was spending on democracy assistance, and she couldn't get an answer. Because no one had an answer. So her thinking was, we ought to at least know how much we're spending on democracy assistance. And the administration had, even by 2005, dramatically increased foreign assistance, actually doubled it. And you can see other problems, like and I think this was 2004, the State Department set up an office called SCRS, Office for Conflict Reconstruction and Stabilization, the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, which was an office which was designed to deal with these post-conflict situations, obviously dramatically important issue for the U.S. government and the Bush administration. There was no existing bureau in the State Department where this office could sit, so it got put in the Secretary's office. So people could see that this was really kind of a mess. And when we looked at options for reform, we looked at two kinds of issues. One was reforming the account structure, and the second was changing the organizational structure. And ultimately, you'll see we came out someplace which very much reflected what the administration saw as major political constraints on what we could do. So when we thought about reforming the account structure, let me tell you what we thought about doing, which we never did. We thought about, instead of these 19 accounts, trying to change the structure of the accounts into 4 accounts, an account for what we'd call fragile states. And this very much mirrored some thinking that AID had been doing. Recovering states, stable but underdeveloped states, and then what were called transition states, which would be basically the MCC countries that were better governed. This didn't at all map, this new account structure wouldn't have at all mapped onto the existing bureaucratic structure at USAID or the State Department, which is basically regional bureaus and some functional bureaus, but not functional bureaus that deal with this kind of stuff. So it would have been a big, really quite a big lift from a bureaucratic point of view. More to the point, more importantly, doing this would have required major legislation and complete rewriting of the Foreign Assistance Act, which is one of these acts which was, I think was originally passed in 59, but maybe it was 62, and has then been amended many, many times. So if you read through the whole thing, I mean, your eyes glaze over and you can't figure out whether it's actually internally consistent. But it obviously would have required complete dumping of that and complete rewriting of the act and a major legislative initiative. And when people, with some political savvy looked at this at the end of 2005, they said, impossible, we can't do this. So it just got dropped, even though we had actually done in policy planning a budget crosswalk of the existing money into the new account structure. So politics at that point, there was no policy window to be able to make this change. Even though you can make an argument that if you're really thinking about effectiveness of US government policy, this is something that really would have been worth doing. All right, we then looked at a set of organizational options and actually settled finally on one. So here were the organizational options, and these are obviously going to be in play as things move forward. One was to create a new cabinet-level agency for reconstruction, stabilization, and development. There will definitely be people close to Obama who will support this as an initiative for the next administration. And there's a report from a commission called the HELP Commission, which was a congressionally mandated commission, in which a dissenting group advocates creating a new cabinet-level agency. So you basically have USAID, a number of State Department bureaus, some offices in the Treasury Department, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which runs a Millennium Challenge account, and some activities, foreign assistance activities, that are now in the Defense Department, Health and Human Services, and Agriculture, moved into a new cabinet-level agency. Some countries, like the British, have a cabinet-level agency for international development, DFID. So Department for International Development. So that was one idea that people had. The second idea that people had was to create a second Deputy Secretary of State for Development and Humanitarian Aid, which people thought would somehow deal with this ambiguity about who is actually in charge of foreign aid, because you also had the administrator of USAID sitting over here. But there were two big problems with this. One is that the administrator of AID also has the rank of Deputy Secretary, A. And B, if you had two Deputy Secretaries dealing with foreign assistance, who was supposed to be in charge of what? Completely nothing. We thought about also creating an Undersecretary of State for Development. There is no Undersecretary of State for Development now. But if you did that, how would that work, since the administrator of AID would formally have a higher rank and in some ways greater authority? So that didn't work. So ultimately what we recommended was creating a new position called a Director of Foreign Assistance. This was something that the Secretary of State could do on her own authority, did not require legislation. And the Director for Foreign Assistance, DFA, would be in charge of foreign assistance in both the State Department and AID. And this person would also, and this was the idea of dual hatting, this person would also be the administrator of AID. So the first person who did this was Randall Tobias, and he's left, and the person who's doing it now is Henrietta Ford. So he basically took the administrator of AID, who had been sitting down in the Reagan building on 14th Street, and you brought them back, at least a lot of the time, to the State Department, and you gave them authority over State Department programs. So this was a final decision. I do think this makes sense. Implementing it has been incredibly difficult, because you still have State and AID with very different views about how this should work. But it has at least given the Secretary of State some ability to reach down and control the foreign assistance activities that are within the State Department and AID. There was never an effort to formally integrate foreign assistance activities from other departments. And it's interesting because if you look at the Foreign Assistance Act, there's quite a lot of ambivalence over what authority the State Department has. So if you look at the way in which the United States government interacts with the World Bank and the IMF, the Secretary of the Treasury appoints the executive directors to the bank and the fund. But there's something in the Foreign Assistance Act which says something like the Secretary of State shares authority over these activities with the Secretary of the Treasury. I don't remember exactly what it says. In practice, that's never happened. And if a Secretary of State tried to do that, I'm sure that you get a tremendous amount of pushback from the Treasury Secretary, even in situations like the one you have now, where I think the relations between Rice and Paulson are excellent. So that there was the idea, what we ended up saying was that the hope was that this new Director of Foreign Assistance would provide some kind of guidance, not coordination. We tried in the final memo to say that the Director of Foreign Assistance would coordinate foreign assistance activities in the U.S. government. And the National Security Council people pushed back and said, no, we coordinate activities. You, the State Department, cannot coordinate activities. So you can provide guidance, but you can't coordinate activities. But in reality, I mean, the bottom line here is coordination is incredibly challenging. And if other people want to do different things, it's not likely that they'll do it. So that's my second story. You're looking at a situation in which you had a good idea. I mean, this wasn't an academic idea. You know, it may not be the most brilliant idea in the world. Implementing it has been tremendously difficult. And doing something really ambitious is going to require legislative action. And legislative action requires opening a policy window. And as Kingdon argues, policy windows are opened by politics, not by having a good idea. So it's not the policy alternatives that open a policy window. It's the politics that open a policy window. And I think it would be very interesting in the next administration to see how this issue is framed. And if I can, just step back and say something, I think that if you could kind of think about U.S. government organization from the ground up right now, and you could start anew and you ask what we would do, you would not create separate units for you wouldn't have a separate USAID, State Department, and Defense Department. You'd have a single unit that integrated all of those functions. I was speaking to someone, maybe a new graduate student at Stanford, a couple of days ago, an Army captain who'd been in Iraq. And he said he was stationed outside of Tikrit, and they were trying to think about what they could do in terms of activities for the local area, and he said, a small industrial zone, in which they gave people that were operating. They had several Iraqi companies operating in this industrial zone. They gave them easier access to the U.S. military base so they could get in and out relatively easily, as opposed to taking half a day. And he said, I was never trained to do this. No one ever trained me to do this. So you would have, it's clear, a lot of the challenges that we're looking at in terms of our foreign policy are challenges that involve diplomacy, military activity, and foreign assistance. And we don't have a good way of integrating these activities out. I have to say, of course, parenthetically, we don't exactly know what to do either, so it's very hard to do it. But it's pretty clear, and it's also the case that if you look at allocation between civilian and military activities, including the nuclear program, is $700 billion plus. Foreign assistance activities, state and AID, is $40 billion. Everyone in Washington would say that this is misallocated. But, if you gave another $100 billion to the State Department, it's not evident that the State Department would be able to use it effectively. So it's a huge challenge to think about how you should organize the U.S. government to meet the foreign policy challenges that we have. And I think you'll certainly see this tackled in some way, I think, regardless of who the next administration is. All right, I'm going to give you my fourth story extremely quickly, so we have some time for questions. This was a straight kind of academic story. I wrote an article in 2004, which was published in International Security, about shared sovereignty. And the basic argument was that if you have states with weak capacity, you might want to think about essentially contracting out government services. I was sitting in the staff bus, actually outside of the transformational diplomacy speech. And I was sitting next to Sean McCormick, who's the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, who does the daily press briefings. And he said, we should really think about some initiatives for the Secretary that would have, some kind of lasting impact, even if they're not these kind of super big things. And so we actually went out on policy planning, thought about several of these, a couple of them, some dealing with energy, and then this initiative dealing with contracting out of government services actually did come to fruition. So here's an academic idea which required kind of working it through the bureaucracy, thinking about how you might do this, getting at least some buy-in, selling it internationally, and finally setting up at the OECD an advisory unit, a small advisory unit, the idea of which is to give countries that are interested in contracting out some services advice on how they can do that most effectively. So that if you're interested in using an external actor to provide health services for a particular city, for instance, this advisory unit at the OECD might be able to tell you who in the international environment could do that most competently. But this was a case of a completely academic idea, which actually did get translated into a policy initiative. But you can see if you look at this convergence of a problem, a solution, and a person, it was entirely a haphazard function of who was actually there, that is me, and wouldn't have happened otherwise. So I think if you're looking at policy making and thinking about this issue of closing the gap, I do think that this garbage can / kingdom model of streams is the most useful way of looking at it. It points out that the policy-making process is incredibly complex. It's not just a function of having good ideas. And even if we did have better ideas in academia about what we should be doing about some of these major foreign policy challenges, it wouldn't necessarily translate in any kind of direct and obvious way into actual foreign policy. So let me stop there, and we've got a half hour or so for questions.
When you were a younger scholar, Steve, you wrote a critique of Graham Allison's book, and I just want you to remind me what the title of that article was.
I wish it was the title was Alice in Wonderland. I wish that I'd been clever enough to think it up, but I actually think Huntington was the editor of one of the editors of Foreign Policy at that time, and anyway, it didn't come from me. It was sort of a degree of hubris in that I was like, an assistant professor then.
Well, for the graduate students in the audience, I highly recommend reading it. It's an excellent critique of Graham Allison's, and it also, I will always give you the credit for the title. It's the cleverest title I think I've read in all of my years of reading political science stuff. But anyway,
I still think it was right after working in the bureaucracy. I want to say that.
Well, I was reminded when you were critical of Krasner after Mons.
Steve, among the several important issues you've raised, it seems a paramount one in both an analytical and policy sense of issues are those associated with transformational diplomacy. In the jargon, what it suggests is a refocusing on the second image, which is sort of compelling given post-Cold War circumstances. Well, that has turned out to be exceptionally challenging. And if we were to use American policies in the Middle East over the last 100 years as our empirical point of reference, what we've discovered is we seem to be deficient in terms of cultural sensitivity and pretty much oblivious to history. What are the implications of that for two things? One, what academics should be doing. Does this point to a revival of area studies? And two, how does that kind of information, which is also available on the CIA, state intelligence, etc., work its way up to have really a central place in the policy process?
Yeah, it does. I mean, my view is the simple, straightforward thing to say is, yeah, what the kind of information that I felt we needed in government was area studies information. We needed to know what was going on in detail in a specific country or place. What exactly, could Musharraf do in Fatah, the frontier and tribal areas? Now, you can say, to be kinder to academics and to honor my colleague David Layton, you could say, look, what you really want are scholars who do both. With deep area studies knowledge and analytic knowledge. But I would say, in terms of the policy-making environment, having deep area studies knowledge, descriptive knowledge, was actually the most useful knowledge that people had. I still don't understand. I don't have a good answer to your question about the intelligence community, where there clearly is a lot of expertise. I found a lot of, I think there are some products that come out of the intelligence community, especially the national intelligence estimates, that are excellent. I found a lot of the products pretty bad. And I'm going to just confess what I don't understand. It's not something about the quality of people working in the intelligence community. It's something about the way the question is, the way in which you're obligated to ask questions, I think. So, For instance, I mean, if you're in the intelligence community, you are prohibited by law from writing about policy itself. You can't comment on the government's policy. And what the intelligence community would always say if we asked them a question was, we want the question to be as specific as possible, as factual as possible. So, I mean, I think that's one set of issues. Within the State Department itself, I thought the kind of thing that you really want that would be useful, including be useful for the Secretary of State, would be a kind of, a good 10 pages on what's going on in a country that had this ring of truth to it, as Clifford Geertz would say. Okay, not necessarily analysis, but a ring of truth. That happens very, very rarely. I mean, I actually saw one memo about a Middle Eastern country, which went on for about 10 pages, which was great, and which people were sort of passing around the department. But here's the story, and it's a problem, and I don't know how to escape from this. I was in Finland last September, and it was after I'd left the government, but I did something at the embassy, so I was talking with the staff. And I asked the DCM about this issue of, were you ever encouraged to do in-depth reporting of the country? And she said, no. Our instructions were not more than 2 pages. That's hard. Now, I have to say, Dan Fried is the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, is a really smart guy and knows a heck of a lot, and it's true that most of the time it wouldn't be any use for him to read 10 pages. But, the basic instructions are do something short. So I found the translation from in-depth kind of area studies knowledge to the policy process to be imperfect. But I don't quite understand why. Our public diplomacy has certainly not been as successful as it might have been. Would it have been better? I mean, I can tell you that the general consensus of people in Washington was that integrating USIS into the State Department was a mistake, the U.S. Information Service Agency, and that it took away, not only people who had this, especially trained to deal with communications issues, but also, people have said to me, took away your ability to report in depth in a way that it's harder to do in the State Department. But again, I'm not sure exactly how to do this. And the problem with setting up a separate agency is, if you want to have an integrated, coordinated policy, it's very difficult to do that if you have a separate agency. Now, I'll give you, the example of AID. AID over the course of the 1990s basically had its technical capacity stripped away. And I think the number of technical employees was reduced from something like 6,000 to 2,000 people. So, there are a lot of things that have happened to AID which have made it a troubled agency. People complain about it, being essentially an agency that just contracts with Beltway bandits. But leaving all those things aside, a fundamental problem is I think the ethos of AID is closer to the ethos of the World Bank than it is to the ethos of the State Department. People in AID see themselves as people with technical skills in the area of development, and that's what they do. There are lots of people with PhDs, much more than you would find in other parts of the government, for instance. If you're asking what you need for effective American foreign policy, I don't think that's the most effective way to do it. So having a separate agency doesn't always work. Okay, I know I'm leading around your answer because I don't have a good response to it. But I don't think that, I think what you have to say is that, first of all, this is a very hard problem. Otherwise, we would have found better solutions to it, A. B, it may also be that we're more legally constrained now. We're constrained in other ways than we were, say, at the beginning of the Cold War. The obvious strategic communications move is to do what we did in the Cold War. What we did in the Cold War was to support the anti-communist left. If you're thinking about the Islamic world, which is not the only problem that we have, but it's certainly an issue if you look at attitudes towards the United States, what you want to be able to do is to support whatever, moderate Islam or whatever, what elements, groups within the Islamic world, that you could work with. Okay, if you're going to do this effectively, you'd have to do it covertly. Could you do it covertly in the contemporary environment? Probably not. So I think one problem is that our hands are tied in ways that they might not have been tied in earlier periods. But I'm afraid, I know that's another long-winded way, but I don't have a great answer to the question.
As Jim mentioned part of your critique was of more rational actor models. But I'm wondering if even your description isn't overly generous to the rationality of the government, in the sense that you argue that the government actually explores all of the policy alternatives, and so if you're going to win, you're going to have to prove that you're better than the other alternatives. I guess that was in step number 2. So let me give you a for instance, which is near and dear to my heart, which was the U.S. government decision to recognize the independence of Kosovo. I was in touch with folks in our government and with other governments, and from everything I heard, there was no big debate. The decision was made. It was made again with people close to the secretary, and then it was just steamrolled, and there was never really consideration of alternatives. So is my research wrong, or is your story of rational debate and the best option winning wrong?
Okay, this is a very good question. So I want to say 2 things. One, this is a problem when you put a chapeau onto a talk that you've already given and you haven't thought it through, because I think your comment is absolutely apt. And the argument about the policy streams garbage can model doesn't necessarily say that the best policy wins. So it doesn't say that. I mean, the chance of a solution being attached in this original article, basically what March, Cohn, and Olson argue is that there's a kind of randomness in what kind of solutions are attached to what problems. And you may have 100 solutions out there, but only one may be kind of available at a particular moment, or maybe 50 are available, or maybe 75, or maybe 20. So it's definitely not a story about the best solution working out. And I have to say, my problem in thinking about this is to think about how that sort of fits with Kingdon's argument about the policy soup, which is that you're thinking hard about the best solution might not work out because you don't know what the best solution is, but something that's been pretty well cooked is likely to work, which doesn't always happen either. So, okay, I want to say I have to think about that more. And I don't have a great answer to that. But I think if you look at the Kosovo situation, I never heard someone arguing for an alternative position. And I think I never heard someone arguing for an alternative position because it would have meant going up against the Europeans in a way that we were not prepared to do. So I don't think we would do it. So it was off the table for politics, because it's true there might be some other solution out there, and we know the story. You're creating this little mini state, run by a bunch of gangsters and what have you. So it's not, it's not exactly clear that this is the best alternative available. But I think from a politics point of view, we didn't see an alternative. So it wasn't that people hadn't. It wasn't that someone rambling around at some point in the past hadn't thought about this. But I never, I think they had thought about it and just said this isn't going to work.
Well, I won't belabor it, but maybe we'll talk later. But from the Europeans' perspective, they said, why is the U.S. forcing this on us?
Oh, really? Interesting.
So not kind of.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah,
interesting. Okay, then that's interesting. And then I don't have a good story for you.
But I think he has pointed out one aspect of your formulations about policy planning, and that is that the problem comes up and is generated somehow, and then you've got this looking at alternatives, and then you've got hopefully a political and policy window. And from my years in Washington, that is what you hope for as a policymaker. But the people further up, at least the ones that I used to know many years ago, used to refer to all of you the munchkins. And there is a lot of policy which is simply, let's get the munchkins out of the way, this is what we're going to do. Now how do we keep this thing from showing up in the New York Times? And, or more specifically, how do we talk to the New York Times to make sure it doesn't show up to the New York Times? And sometimes they're right, and other times they're wrong. So I guess my question is, you as a policymaker, how do you keep this within the policy-making bounds and not let it get up into that world?
Okay, I think your description is partly but not completely accurate. So part of the issue is, if you look at policymaking within the U.S. government, it's such a complex process, and it's legislatively complex. You look at the interagency process, you start with a memo, and you write a memo, and then you send it around to clearance. And every bureau and agency puts in its paragraph. So at the end, what you've got is mashed potatoes. You know, when it's like, I remember one thing we did at the NSC was like a joke of this process, because you could just see how, you know, everybody had added on something else. So it's true that the process is, you know, certainly not one in which everything kind of, you know, there's some, and this I think is captured by this garbage can idea. You know, there are different garbage cans around. So what goes into one can may not necessarily go into another can, and you may see as a policymaker that putting something in this garbage can will mean that nothing's going to come out at the other end. So I'll give you, I mean, my example, you know, one example which I know, specifically the Millennium Challenge account, which I worked on in 2002. The people at the White House that were driving this process, especially Gary Etzen, were extremely, was the Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic Affairs, really wanted to make sure, okay, that the president's vision for this was honored. You know, and the idea here was we were going to give a substantial amount of money as foreign assistance based on these third-party objective quantified indicators. Not who was allying with us, not who was voting for us in the UN. And we were going to make the indicators that were public, they were not our indicators, we couldn't manipulate them. And, you know, fighting off, you know, the Africa bureaus that wanted, you know, people that were doing Africa want to say, we want 50% for us. Or we want to make sure that X amount is going to go for education. Was something that could only be done if you, okay, you could say we were the Munchkins part of it. But, you know, there are clearly other issues, I think, where you're looking at, and I don't, you know, feel that I was close enough to actually have seen, you know, to have seen some of these really major decisions. Okay, if you ask me about Iraq, okay, I wasn't there when that happened, but here's what I think, and a little bit supported by secondary literature. The State Department had this Iraq study group, and they did this 400-page report. But it wasn't a 400-page report of something that was operational. So once you had a commitment to going in, you wanted someone to tell you something about what you thought might possibly work. Now, was that the most well-worked-out idea in the world? Obviously, it was not. But it was the idea that was available then. So I think even if you're looking at, you know, the top, I think it's fair to say that it's not just that policymakers have problems, and they are then, it's not the case that they have problems and then they're making up solutions. I mean, they have problems, they might have some idea for what the solution is, but they clearly have to rely on the Munchkins to some extent to make the thing work, because you have to know what's out there in the bureaucracy. But it's also the case that, you know, they don't want to lose things in the bureaucratic process, and the question of having something, the leak problem is, I found, quite a substantial problem. So if you had a really sensitive issue, you wouldn't write a memo about it, right? I mean, you might talk to the secretary directly, or you might hand her a piece of paper, but you wouldn't write a memo that would go through the normal process. I mean, I can tell you what I think, you know, in these last two questions, what I think the problem is for me that I have to think out. You know, there are clearly situations in which policymakers do have, I mean, the Iraq invasion, I mean, clearly people very high up in the American government had a very strong, committed inclination to do this. And if that's happening, I mean, what then did the process, and I wasn't there so I don't know, you know, what does the process look like in terms of, you know, these kind, you know, thinking about this as a garbage can model, or policy streams, and it may be that there are only a couple of solutions that could possibly get attached to the problem in that environment, even though there might have been a lot of other solutions out there.
Couldn't it be that maybe the garbage can model works well for, it seems like most of the stories that you were telling, which are decision making from the bottom up in a way, and I think what the motivation in the question there, and I took in Alan's question is, what about when it comes from the top down? And, you know, do you need something different than the garbage can kind of metaphor? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think the idea here, and it's very clear in Kingdon, is, I mean, a problem gets generated. Okay, 9/11, Katrina, Penn Central going bankrupt. So the guys at the top are sitting there thinking, we got to do something about this. So the problem, I mean, especially if it's crisis generated, but even if it's not crisis generated, they're there. They don't necessarily know what the solution is, but they have to address the problem. So I think this is something that definitely can work from the top down as well as a kind of bottom up kind of formulation.
Steve, I want to ask a two-part question, drawing upon the two things you've done in your career, both as a scholar and as a director of policy planning. Let me begin with policy planning first, which is, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, policy planning is designed to provide independent analysis of the Secretary of State. The notion is that we would be more forward-looking. It is historically drawn. A lot of it is a distinguished scholarly background, staff members otherwise. But America has been also critical of policy planning, that it sort of lost the luster that it had in the halcyon days when Kennedy and other greats of American foreign policy walked the earth. So I guess the first question really is policy planning doing what it's supposed to do? Is it itself using the things to real world? The second question is to go back to academia, because my experience is similar to yours. I don't think it's the case that scholars are punished for having a policy interest or wanting to go into government, but I certainly never got the impression that they're encouraged to do so. And so the question is, since you've been the chair of the department, you've been through the tenure process, you know how the whole thing operates, what are your thoughts on how you might change that default value where it's not neutral, but actually encouraged for people to develop either deep area studies information or go into government? And Michael's quite right. I think you're quite right that when particularly crises pop up, it's good to know a lot of detail about the country you're dealing with, which isn't what most political science departments reward people for doing. So any ideas on how to fix that balance?
Yeah, let me say, answer the first question first. You asked this question, has it deteriorated from its halcyon days with Kennan? Well, the problem is Kennan's the only guy there. There were a lot of pretty well-known people, including Jim Steinberg and a lot of others, Dennis Ross, Mort Halperin, Paul Nitze, that have been directors of policy planning. There's only one name that people know. So there was this one shot, and, the containment long telegram was written when Kennan was still in Moscow. So I don't think policy planning ever does long-term planning of this sort, ever, and it hasn't done it. Not only hasn't it done it, it can't do it. Too much uncertainty, it's not worth doing. Secretary of State doesn't have time. It's not worth writing a memo on what the world's going to be like in 2020 for her, even though there are other parts of the U.S. government that do it. So here's what I think policy planning does. It does conceptualizations, which is part of what the policy process is, and that's containment, but it's also this responsible stakeholder idea. And these conceptualizations are really important. This is something I never appreciated as an academic. They get into speeches, and if they get into speeches, there are things that people could point to in terms of more specific policy initiatives, but they really do guide policy. It mattered, that the Bush administration focused on democracy as a basic strategy for dealing with the challenges that we're facing. Absolutely mattered. And there were other ways in which they could have framed their solution to the challenge. So one thing it does is conceptualization, so it still does that. Second thing policy planning has done is specific initiatives. So this Partnership for Democratic Governance is an example of that. Mort Halperin worked on the Community of Democracies, which is another example. Thirdly, it sometimes means that you just have a smart person who's there that the secretary can draw on. So basically, I haven't asked Dennis Ross this, but I've been told that Dennis Ross sort of left his office in policy planning and moved around the corner into the secretary's suite when he was working on Middle East stuff. And basically, that's what Dennis Ross did. So I think you should think about policy planning. This fits much more the garbage can model. It's a big government. It's pretty wealthy. And having a place in government where you can bring together career civil servants, foreign service officers, and external experts is a good thing to do. Will it systematically help you? No. Can it help you in some circumstances? Yeah. Can you predict when and how? Not exactly. But I think this sort of conceptualization initiatives and specific policy involvement is actually what policy planning really does in reality, and not long-term planning. And in doing, I have to say, all of these things, you have to recognize that this is not the only place where there are smart people in government or people that think analytically. So if you want to get, if you have an idea, you've got to be able to sell it to other parts of the bureaucracy. I think on this question, the question of academia, the basic problem that you're looking at is this, that academia is kind of, an entirely self-referential system, at least in the short and medium term. We reward each other based on what we think good work is. There's never any kind of looking to the outside world. And you can look at disciplines, and this is not political science. You can look at disciplines that are just dying. Okay, and if you're a tenured professor, you might not actually care. All right, I think that, and it's very hard to see how to get out of the self-referential, because you're in a market of your own creation. From the university's point of view, I mean, it's not a very good thing to have departments which have no students. I mean, that's also not political science or international relations, but there are a number of departments like that. And so what can the university do? They sort of let these departments die slowly over a long period of time. I think that the solution, and this is something that I think, although it's not a solution, that means changing the discipline. And it speaks to this area studies problem, in which, look, I admit, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have been quite critical of area studies. By which I would have said, basically situations where you have people that are essentially doing descriptions of places. And I do think, you have a kind of ideal for what it should be. You should know, be able to have all the tools and also be able to do the descriptions. But it's hard. Now, I will say sometimes, though, if you look at how this has worked in economics and economic development, there are a lot of people in economic development now doing experimental design work. And this is basically, what's happened is, it's like anthropologists with really good methodological skills, and it's really good. So you'll go out and go to Kenya and look at 3 different ways of dealing with water health, water cleanliness, and think about 3 ways in which you can deal with this. You can give people pills to purify the water. You can put a concrete cap on top of a well. You can ask them to boil the water, and you can then look, and there's a very interesting study that's been done by a guy at Berkeley and Harvard on this, and ask yourself, where do you get the best results in terms of incidence of childhood diarrhea? Okay, I think this works. That's great, and it's actually an example of having all of these skills. I think it's going to be very hard, though, to move back towards area studies. So I think what's happening in universities is this, and in the larger environment. Let me say that in the larger environment, I think the first thing to recognize is that the U.S., by and large, historically, over time, has had an extremely successful foreign policy compared to other countries. I'm talking about big aggregates here. Other countries have usually screwed up mightily in a number of different instances. I do think that part of this is a result of the fact that it's such an open system. France is still run by, it's not Sarkozy, but a bunch of guys who graduated from ENA, École Nationale d'Administration, and that's it. If you didn't go there, you're never going to make it in the French system. If you look at foreign policy in most other countries, that I know about, say, Germany and Britain, academics have 0 role. And I think the fact that you have in the United States, one, this inner and outer thing, where there are many more political appointments in the U.S. government than in other governments, has some minuses, but also has big pluses. You have this very robust think tank world, with a lot of smart people that are doing some of the translating between academia and government, obviously. And what you have in universities, okay, you get public policy schools. We can't have public policy schools, you get institutes of international studies. What are these things doing? They're the intermediaries between the external environment and sometimes the policy environment and academia. So I would say, I think it's fine actually to leave political science alone, even though it has a self-referential character, because there's enough, I think, richness and money in the American system to have these other institutions which are doing some of the things that you want to do in terms of having these inputs into the policy process. Besides, I have no idea how you would change the disciplinary structure.
Okay, well, I would like to thank Dr. Krasner for an excellent talk, also for his service in government and being such an inspiring role model to fellow scholars. To the graduate students in the audience, you could do a lot worse than wall yourself on Steve's career and his commitment to.
They usually aspire to Rice, actually. If they're undergraduates, that's the model.
Okay, well, graduate students go for Steve, and undergraduates can aspire to Dr. Rice. But anyway, please join me in thanking Steve.